So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about why I play healer. This is a video I've been wanting to do for a while because this is the only role that I play, and I just wanted to give some insight to a healer's mind, and I think the reasons I play healer are probably pretty consistent with a lot of other healers as well. First and foremost, I don't really care about DPS meters. I'm just not a naturally competitive person by nature, partially because I was in the Army for 20 years. As a team, you don't really look at your own performance other than to accomplish the goal. Of course, like everyone, I want to be the best. I want to be on top. I do check my parses. I'm happy when I get orange parses, whether that's healing or damage. Every tier, I go for all 99s in DPS parses on my healer just because it's fun. So I completely understand that mindset. But for me, it's more of an afterthought. In the raid, I don't actually care at all. I just want the boss to die. So what I'm looking at is the boss's HP. I'm watching what the boss is doing, and I'm watching what other people are doing so I can figure out how to help them do better DPS. But my personal DPS never really matters. I don't want to be the guy that's lowest on the meters. If I'm top 3, 4, 5, that's good enough for me in a raid, just to make sure that I'm pulling my own weight. The second reason is because healing is not a target dummy. For me, DPS is nothing but trying to turn the boss into a target dummy. So DPS is just like a target dummy simulator, and healing is not like that at all. You can sit at a healing dummy all you want, but you're just really not going to get a good idea of how to heal. However, DPS, it's all about making every fight into a target dummy. There is a very set ideal rotation, and that's what you're trying to achieve. And for the most part, what you're trying to do as a DPS is try to eliminate any movement, try to use as few defenses as possible, few utility as possible, and basically turn the boss into a target dummy. And to me, that seems very boring because you already know the answer to the test. You know exactly what you're supposed to be pressing, when you're supposed to be pressing it, and really everything you're doing is trying to get to that perfect rotation. So I understand that that's completely necessary to kill a boss. At the end of the day, you have to have enough damage to kill a boss, so you need a whole bunch of people that are mindset is do as much damage as humanly possible. The only thing that matters is my DPS needs to be as high as possible so that the boss dies. So I don't have anything against DPS players, that's just not my mentality. That's not where my mindset is. I'm trying to look at every single action I take, every button that I press to see if it actually helps other DPS. So it's a little bit different. Even though the goal is the same, as a healer, it feels better to me. It doesn't feel as selfish to be doing everything you're doing to help the raid. And whether DPS want to admit this or not, there's a lot of things that they do to try to optimize their personal DPS that is a negative to the raid. So they're not using utility, they're not using defenses, they're standing still, not getting out of other people's way because they want their own personal DPS to be as high as possible. And ultimately, it often ends in wipes. A lot of the wipes in the early beginnings of progression bosses is due to DPS just trying to do everything they possibly can to increase their personal DPS, which just feels sort of cringe to me, and I don't enjoy doing that. Eventually you figure it out, and there are cases as a DPS. Augmentation Evoker is a great example of where most of what you do is an augmentation. Even though you're trying to do DPS, you really are focusing on the rest of the group, and there's certain spells in the game and certain classes in the game that can do that as well. And certain players that just understand that, so they're going to move out of the way for ranged players. They're going to do certain things to help other people DPS. Even when you watch the World First Race, you see DPS that are cheating, trying to get every little personal bit of DPS for themselves, and it sometimes does affect other players, even at the highest levels. And for me, that's just not a play style I enjoy. The third reason is because I like to help succeed. My background is 20 years in the Army as a trainer and a leader. That's what I did, and that's where I get the most enjoyment, is helping people and watching them succeed based on the teaching, training, mentoring, leading that I've done for them. So healing is very much in line with that. I get the most enjoyment out of other people's success. So being honed in my own personal numbers and how I personally do just feels very empty to me. No matter how good I personally do, if the rest of the raid is failing, then it just doesn't feel as good. So DPS just doesn't have the same hold on me as healing does. On the other hand, when you're healing other people, you're doing all those little things that allow the DPS to do more damage, and that is actually very fun and fulfilling for me. I don't care if they stand in fire as long as I can heal them through it, because my goal is to make them a success. One of the things I enjoy most is when a DPS makes a mistake, forget to use a defensive, stands in something, and then I hear them say that, I can't believe you healed me through that. They get this big bomb of a heal from a healer, and they know that it was me, and so they can keep going. They didn't have to use a defensive, or maybe they could save it for a later time that would have resulted in them dying, and then I see them on top of the meters later on. Like, I know that I helped them be a success. And also newer players too, the ones that do stand in fire all the time and do mess up and do make mistakes. And if I'm able to kind of keep an eye on them with Shaman, you put your Earth Shield on them, and then you're just kind of babysitting them, make them your primary target of your chain heal, and normally they would be dying every pull, but you're able to kind of keep them alive and help them so they can contribute. Maybe. And the last piece of that too is working with other healers to coordinate cooldowns. That's also a big leadership thing, is coordinating with other people, coordinating with other leaders, and us working together on our cooldowns and covering each other's gap. Number 4 is I like being relied upon. Very in line with being in the military and serving is that feeling of people relying on what you do. And, if we really look at it, most of the times when a DPS dies, no one really cares. No one bats an eye. You care that you lost a battle res, which could have been used for a healer or a tank. And to me, that's not the reliability I want. When a healer dies, you feel it. If it's in an M+, you definitely know. And usually you fall behind in healing, and that healer needs to come up right away and start healing, and try to save the group. But a lot of times that ends up in a wipe, and I like that reliance. In a raid, you can feel it on the prog bosses. It's almost never that you hear a DPS die and then the raid leaders are up, let's wipe it. It does happen on very, very cutting edge content, and it does happen occasionally if you have a particular DPS who is maybe killing a certain set of ads or breaking people out of roots, but that doesn't happen very often. But a healer, it's virtually every prog fight, anything that goes over 15, 20 pulls, you need all those healers alive, and if a healer goes down, it's a big deal. You also feel the difference when you have really good healers. When you have even 3, 4, 5 really good DPS in there, the boss is dying a little bit faster, but realistically, the fight is going about the same. Again, there's exceptions, especially when you're talking about having to kill ads in a certain amount of time or beating DPS checks. But again, when you have a good set of DPS, it doesn't feel different. But when you have a really good healing team, you know it. Everyone lives. When people that clearly should have died survive, the raid survives things that they just shouldn't have survived. Mistakes could be made, and healers can pull them through it. You have your main healers out, especially if you have 2 of your main healers out. Normally, you can definitely feel the difference. That feeling of showing up late to a raid or missing a raid, and then you come back and your whole team is like, oh, thankfully light's back. Okay, we need our good healers. Like, it's night and day difference sometimes between healing teams, and that's a really great feeling. Along with that, I like the feeling of the DPS knowing that they have a strong healing team. There's a lot of times where they're DPSing and they make a comment knowing that their healers have their back. They can make those little mistakes. They can position a little bit differently. They can play a little bit riskier because they know that their healing team is that strong that they're going to be able to recover if something goes wrong. If they get caught out of position, they're going to be okay because they know that they're going to get a defensive, an external, or a heal from a healer, and they're going to be okay. The last reason, and probably the one that is the biggest for me, is it is by far the most dynamic role in the game. It doesn't even come close, in my opinion. I've played tank, I've played DPS, and the dynamic moment to moment reaction that you have to have as a healer is unparalleled compared to a tank or a DPS. DPS is a very set rotation, and if you're doing the boss right, there is a very right answer to every single moment of that fight. It's very scripted, and the only thing that changes is if there's a mistake, you may have to adjust some of your cooldown timings. So there is some adjustment, there is some adaptability, but ultimately what you're trying to do is have a very, very set rotation because your damage is unlimited. You do as much damage as you can possibly do, and the right way to do that is to hit your rotation perfectly. So you're spending the entire fight trying to hit that perfect rotation. Again, I understand that appeals to some people. That's exactly what they want, and that's what they enjoy in trying to get that perfect rotation. That's just not necessarily how I like to play. Tanking is a bit more dynamic, but it is similar. There's positioning. There's ads that you have to pick up. You have to adjust your spells to pick those up, have to adjust your spell timings for tank busters, that sort of thing. But I do still feel it's pretty scripted. There's a set rotation, and you have to hit your active mitigation at a certain time. You have to hit your big tank buster mitigation at the right time. Their position is set. You know exactly where it is that you need to go. Not always easy to do that, but it still is fairly scripted. But it is more dynamic. I'm not saying it's not, but I just don't think it's nearly as dynamic as a healer. Literally every decision that a DPS or a tank makes affects the button you press moment to moment as a healer. Every spell queuing matters. If a spell queue flip flops for some reason, all of a sudden your spells are changing. Missed interrupts changes it. Missed defensives changes your buttons. DPS standing in something bad. Tanks that are out of position. Literally everything that happens could affect the buttons that you have to press in that exact moment. There is no set rotation. There is a rotation. There is an ideal rotation, but it only works if it's unlimited healing, which is not the case. It's the only role that has a cap to how much healing you can do. If you follow your perfect set rotation, you are not going to heal well. Your healing numbers are going to be low. Anytime you see a new healer try to heal, this is seen because they just try to hit this perfect rotation and they can't understand why their healing numbers are so low. And the reason their healing numbers are so low is because you have to balance your rotation in every single button press and match that to the amount of damage that the raid is taking. So your rotation doesn't really work, at least not at the highest levels. Not when you're taking massive damage, and especially when it's spiky, where you take this massive amount of damage for 20-30 seconds, and then you take virtually no damage for 15-20 seconds, and then you take rot damage for 30 seconds straight, and then no damage again. It is so dynamic because just pressing your rotation, you could do it perfectly, exactly like the guides say, and your healing will be absolute garbage if you're not using your cooldowns at the right time. You use your cooldowns at the wrong time as a DPS, your DPS is still going to be high, it's just not going to be quite as high. But if you use your cooldowns wrong as a healer, especially some of the ramp healers that are out there, your healing is going to be in the dumpster to the point where you are ineffective and you can't heal the encounter, and you just don't get there as a DPS or a tank. So I absolutely love the moment-to-moment challenge in a raid environment, especially where you're watching what everybody does and any mistakes that are made, and then having to change your rotation, what spells you're going to be using in a moment-to-moment. For me, the moment I enjoy the most is when a major mistake is made, and the raid later says something along the lines of, just try to live, but we're probably going to die. And then the healers just go into super healer mode, they're popping all their cooldowns, they're all covering for each other, and they're just perfectly matching their cooldowns and their healing for exactly the damage that's coming. And normally you know it's coming, you know it's going to last 20-30 seconds because it's usually some debuff that's slamming the raid, and you have to figure out how to make what you have available to you and what buttons you're going to press, and press them perfectly for 20-30 seconds to keep that raid alive. And normally they would die. And when that happens, and then you hear, especially a DPS, because I feel like sometimes DPS don't appreciate their healers, and when a DPS comes across and says, I don't know how we live that, our healers are cracked, that to me is the greatest feeling. And that's what I kind of live for. This happens in other roles. There are other times where it's like a DPS dies, so you have to have a DPS run over and take care of the ads, or there's some boss burn you have to do and you don't think you're going to be able to do it, or a tank. This happens quite often with tanks where they're about to die, and like if they die, that's it. It's going to wipe, and somehow they pull out some miraculous rotation where they're able to actually survive. But it's very rare that that happens, and DPS is even more rare. It's very rare. There are times, again, at the very end of the fight, there's 5% left, you need to eke out that last little bit of DPS. But in all honesty, if you think about it, that sort of thing happens with healers all the time. A progression fight to progression fight, even in the beginning of progression, when you're just trying to live to see into the next phase, healers are constantly pulling out this miraculous healing to keep people alive just another minute or two so they can see the next phase. That's just part of the job for a healer, is just pulling out miracles, and that's what we do.